From where I see it, we're standing on the precipice of a cliff. What COVID has taught us is that we are globally connected as a tribe, and we're driven more by fear than by fortune. The scared, stampeding herd mentality is now more alive than ever, and the mainstream media, and to some extent some global governments, use this against us for their benefit. How we continue to perceive fear and react to it will be crucial to what happens from here. And as I've said on many occasions before, the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. But we all have an opportunity to change that because our eyes are now open. We're at a major crossroads, and what we
Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how and where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You'll hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested.
Hi, freedom fighters. Let me start today by asking you 3 questions. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? How deep and how long will the recession be? And what can you do about reversing it? And how will the recently announced federal budget impact on this? And what does this mean to you? And what do you need to do as a result? Now, at the time of this episode, countries and economies around the world are struggling to reverse the worldwide recession that has flowed from government responses to the pandemic. And we all find ourselves at a crossroad. So what we individually and collectively think and do next will be absolutely mission critical to our lives, our lifestyles, and our livelihoods moving forward. Because it's going to go one of 2 ways. And it will all depend on how we individually think and act. So to help you to make sense of what our options are, today's episode breaks with Get Invested tradition to create some context for our decision making by exploring how the economy works, how does the federal government's budget fit into this, and what is the budget endeavouring to actually achieve? Also, what do we then need to do as a result to avoid peril and return to prosperity? The episode then concludes by giving you some food for thought on how you need to think, how you can reduce your risk, and where are the emerging opportunities through my recent interviews as the host of Australia's most popular and longest running property podcast, where I've been sitting in for Kevin Turner on the Real Estate Talk Show, that you can actually watch in full and is actually the go-to place to answer all of your property questions from all of the industry leaders. And you can find that at Real Estate Talk, which is at www.channels.realty, that's realty.com.au/Real Estate Talk. So to set the scene and also the context for the big decision that you need to make, let's start with a simple explanation of how the economy actually works and how what you do impacts on it. And I'm going to borrow from the fantastic work done by the American billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio, where he describes how the economic machine works in simple layman's terms. The economy works like a simple machine, but many people just don't understand it, or they don't agree on how it works, and this has led and continues to lead to a lot of needless economic suffering. Though the economy might seem complex, and it works in a simple mechanical way, it's made up of a few simple parts and a lot of simple transactions that are repeated over and over and over again a zillion times. And these transactions, above all else, are driven by human nature. So by understanding how human nature and these simple transactions combine, we create a good template for tracking economic movements and figuring out what's happening now and what governments and ourselves need to be doing moving forward. An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up, and a transaction is a very simple thing. We all make transactions all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services or financial assets. Credit, or borrowed money, spends just like money. So adding together the money spent and the amount of credit spent, you know the total spending. The total amount of spending drives the economy. And this is why spending is so important to our future. But I'll come back to that later. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. And that's it. That's a transaction. It's the building block of the economic machine. All cycles and all forces in an economy are driven by spending transactions. So, if we can understand spending transactions, we can understand the whole economy. Now, a market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers making all transactions for the same thing. So, for example, there's a wheat market and a farm market, a stock market, and markets for millions of things. An economy consists of all the transactions across all of its markets. So if you add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets, you have everything you need to know to understand the economy. That's as simple as it gets. So you, me, and everyone else, businesses, banks and governments, all engage in spending transactions in exactly this way. We and they all exchange money and credit for goods, services and financial assets. Now the biggest buyer and seller is the government, which consists of two really important parts. In Australia's case, it's the federal government that collects taxes and spends money, and the central bank or reserve bank, which is different from other buyers and sellers because it controls the amount of money and credit in the economy. And it does this by influencing interest rates and the printing of new money. For these reasons, the Central Reserve Bank is an important player in the flow of credit, and it's important to pay attention to credit or debt borrowings. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because it's the biggest and the most volatile part. And just like buyers and sellers go to the market to make transactions, so do lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can afford, like a house or a car, or they want to invest in something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. Borrowers promise to pay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount called interest. When interest rates are high, there's less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's cheaper. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, they're able to increase their spending, and remember, spending transactions drive the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns, and every dollar you earn, someone else spends. So when you spend more, someone else earns more. When someone's income rises, it makes lenders more willing to lend them more money because now they're more worthy of credit. And a credit-worthy borrower has two things. That's the ability to repay and the collateral that they develop. So having a lot of income in relation to their debt this gives them the ability to repay. And in the event that they can't repay, they have valuable assets to use as collateral that can then be sold to cover it. This makes lenders feel comfortable lending them money. So, increased income allows increased borrowing, which allows increased spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, this leads to more increased borrowing, and so the upward spiral continues. This self-reinforcing pattern leads to economic growth. And the biggest driver of economic growth is credit, or borrowed debt, because it allows us to consume more than we produce when we acquire it, and it forces us to consume less than we produce when we have to pay it back. So think of credit or borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford now, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you create a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back, which creates a cycle. So any time you borrow, you create a cycle, which is true for us individually, but also for the economy at large. This is why understanding credit or borrowings is so important, because it sets in motion a mechanical, predictable series of events that will happen in the future, which makes credit different from money. Money is what you settle transactions with. When you buy a beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction's settled immediately, but when you buy a beer with credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future, so together you and the bartender create an asset and a liability, and you've just created credit out of thin air. It's not until you pay the bar tab later that the asset and the liability disappear, the debt goes away, and the transaction's settled. So the reality in this day and age is that most of what people call money is actually credit. And in an economy with credit, you can increase your spending by borrowing. As a result, an economy with credit has more spending and allows incomes to rise faster in the short to medium term. Now, credit or debt can be good or bad. It's bad when it finances overconsumption that can't be paid back. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt. For example, if you borrow money to buy a big TV, it doesn't generate income for you to pay back the debt. But if you borrow money to, say, buy a laptop, and that laptop lets you create a business that helps you earn more money, then you could pay back your debt and improve your living standards. In an economy with credit like ours, we can follow the transactions and see how credit creates growth. As another quick example, let's say you earn $100,000 a year and you're credit worthy enough to borrow an extra $10,000 on a credit card. So you can spend $110,000 even though you only earn $100,000. And since your spending is another person's income, someone else is earning $110,000. The person earning the $110,000 can in turn borrow an extra $11,000, so he can spend $121,000 even though he's only earned $110,000. His spending is another person's income, and by following the transactions we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. And this happens because the increase in spending is fueled by credit, which is created instantly out of thin air. When the amount of spending and income grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. And when prices rise, we call this inflation, which is something we haven't seen in Australia for quite some time now. The Central Reserve Bank doesn't want too much inflation because it causes problems. Seeing prices rise, it generally raises interest rates. With higher interest rates, fewer people can afford to borrow money, and the cost of existing debt rises. Think about this as the monthly payments on your credit card or your home loan going up. Because people borrow less and have higher debt repayments, they have left money left over to spend, and so spending slows. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes drop, and so it continues. When people spend less, prices go down, which is called deflation. Economic activity decreases and we have a recession, which is exactly what we're experiencing in Australia right now. As the recession becomes more severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the Reserve Bank lowers interest rates to cause everything to pick up again, which it's been doing in Australia now since 2012. With lower interest rates, debt repayments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up, and we start to see an expansion again. So as you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short to medium term, spending is constrained only by the willingness of banks and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit's easily available, there's generally an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, as has been the case in Australia over the last few years, even though it's never been cheaper, there's a recession, and this part of the cycle is normally controlled primarily by the Reserve Bank using interest rate movements, although this becomes ineffective when rates are very low like they currently are. Now, when debt repayments are higher relative to people's incomes, they cut back on their spending. And again, since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes begin to go down, which makes people less creditworthy, causing borrowing to go down. Debt repayments continue to rise, which makes spending drop even further, and the cycle reverses on itself. Now, for the United States, Europe and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008 during the global financial crisis, or GFC. And it happened for the same reason in Japan in 1989 and in the US way back in the Great Depression of 1929 when the economy started deleveraging. Now, in deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall, credit disappears, asset prices drop, banks get squeezed, the stock market crashes, social tensions rise, and the whole thing starts to feed on itself the other way. As incomes fall and debt repayments rise, borrowers get squeezed, and as they no longer are creditworthy, credit dries up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. Scrambling to fill this hole, borrowers are then forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets floods the market at the same time as spending falls. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks, and banks start to get into trouble. As asset prices drop, the value of the collateral borrowers can put up drops, which makes borrowers even less creditworthy, people feel poor, and credit rapidly disappears. Less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, less borrowing, and so goes the vicious cycle. This appears similar to a recession, but the difference here is that interest rates can't be lowered to save the day anymore. In a recession, lowering interest rates works to stimulate borrowing. However, in deleveraging, lower interest rates don't work because interest rates are already low and soon hits 0%, so the stimulation ends. Interest rates in the United States hit 0% during deleveraging in the 1930s Great Depression and again in the global financial crisis of 2008. And we're on the tipping point of this happening again now if we don't individually and collectively take the right action. So we need to wake up to the crisis we face if we don't respond the right way very quickly. Now, what usually happens during these times is that spending is cut first as people, businesses and governments tighten their belts and they cut their spending so that they can start paying down their debt. This is often referred to as austerity. When borrowers stop taking on new debts and start paying down old debts, you'd expect the debt burden to decrease, but the opposite actually happens. Because spending is cut, and again, as one person's spending is another person's income, it causes incomes to fall even further. They fall faster than debts that are repaid, and the debt burden actually gets worse. As we've seen in the past, this cut in spending is deflationary and painful. Businesses are forced to cut costs, which means less jobs and higher unemployment. This leads to the next step, where debts must be reduced. Many borrowers find themselves unable to repay their loans, and a borrower's debts are a bank's assets. Now, when a borrower doesn't repay the bank, people get nervous that the bank won't be able to repay them, so they rush to withdraw their money from the bank, banks get squeezed, and people, businesses and banks default on their debts. This severe economic contraction is a depression. And we're teetering on the edge of this happening now if we don't individually and collectively take action very quickly. When an economy is in a slowing recession like ours is now, everything impacts on the central federal government because lower incomes and less employment means the government collects fewer taxes. At the same time, it needs to increase its spending because unemployment's risen. Many of the unemployed have inadequate savings and they need financial support from the government. Additionally, governments create stimulus plans and increase their spending to make up for the decrease in the economy. Government budget deficits explode and are deleveraging because they spend more than they earn in taxes. This is exactly what's about to happen when you hear about the growing budget deficit on the news. Now, having already lowered interest rates to nearly zero, the Reserve Bank is forced to print money. Now, unlike cuts in spending and debt reduction, printing money is actually inflationary and stimulative. But how does it do this? Well, inevitably, the Reserve Bank prints new money out of thin air and uses it to buy financial assets and government bonds, which is exactly what it's been doing over the last few months, and this is actually a good thing. Now, this also happened in the United States during the Great Depression and again in the 2008 GFC, when the United States Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, printed over $2 trillion. Other central banks around the world that could, including Australia's, printed a lot of money too. By buying financial assets with this money, it helps drive up asset prices, which makes people more creditworthy. However, this only helps those who own financial assets. You see, the Reserve Bank can print money, but it can only buy financial assets. The federal government, on the other hand, can buy goods and services and put the money in the hands of the people, but it can't print money. So in order to stimulate the economy, the two of them have got to cooperate, which they've actually been doing extremely well since COVID hit earlier in the year. Now, by buying government bonds, the Reserve Bank essentially lends money to the government, allowing it to run a deficit and increase spending on goods and services through its stimulus programs and its unemployment benefits. This increases people's income as well as the government's debt. However, the real benefit is that it lowers the economy's total debt burden. Now, this is a very risky time, and this is exactly where we're at right now. Politicians and policymakers need to balance the ways that debt burdens come down. The deflationary ways need to balance with the inflationary ways in order to maintain stability. Now remember, spending is what matters. $1 of spending paid for with money has the same effect on price as $1 of spending paid for with credit. So by printing money, the Reserve Bank can come up for the drop credit with an increase in the amount of money. In order to turn things around, the Reserve Bank needs to not only pump up income growth, but get the rate of income growth higher than the rate of interest on the debt. When income begins to rise, borrowers begin to appear more creditworthy, and when borrowers appear more creditworthy, banks lend them more money. And as people borrow money, people spend more, and eventually the economy turns around and begins to grow again, leading out of a recession back into the reflation phase. Now, if balanced correctly, there can be a beautiful deleveraging with which the Reserve Bank and our federal government have set us up to do with the raft of integrated measures and programs that they've progressively been releasing since the beginning of COVID, culminating in the recent federal budget, which has been rightly hailed as the biggest and most important budget in our nation's history. And looking at what they've already done and what they intend to do in the context of the model of the economy we've just been talking about, they've actually set the scene for Australia to complete a beautiful deleveraging and reverse the recession and return to growth with minimum pain and heartache, as long as we, that's you and me, do our part. So it still depends on us. I'll come back to what we need to do shortly if you haven't already worked that out. So let's have a brief look at the federal budget. Now, if you're anything like me, government budgets are generally as boring as watching grass grow. And it's so filled with jargon and gobbledygook that I often can't work out what the hell they're talking about or what, if anything, it's got to do with me. So let me get rid of all the bollocks and the BS and break it down into simple, no-nonsense terms. Now, no surprise given what we've just been talking about, but put very simply, this budget is all about getting us to spend. It's as simple as that. Why? because you can't shrink to grow. If you're going to grow anything, you can't shrink to do it. And given the federal government's knowledge of the workings of the economy, they know full well that if they and we stop spending, then we're going to spiral from recession into a depression. As we've already discussed, what I spend is your income and what you spend is my income. And if we spend less, that means prices go down. That means businesses cut costs. That means incomes go down. Unemployment increases and we spiral into depression. So what the government is trying to do with this budget is to create conditions that allow us to have the confidence to continue to spend. I'm not meaning overspending on anything and everything, but just continuing to spend on the sorts of things that we do day to day that we've always done. Because if we maintain our normal level of spending, which maintains our jobs, which returns the economy to growth, this will build on the integrated raft of the other spending stimulus measures and programs that the government has injected over the last 6 months since the COVID came into place that put the handbrake on the economy. So to continue to stimulate spending, there are 3 key areas that the government has focused their spending measures on. The budget is focused on infrastructure, jobs, and tax cuts. So let's break these down. New infrastructure is nation building and it sets us up for the future. And the new infrastructure is actually a really good move because new infrastructure, when we're talking about roads, rail and major project activity, is going to create immediate jobs and create a lot of spending. But it's also setting us up for continued future growth and the opening up of other areas and regions that are benefiting from the infrastructure works. Now, the budget's talking about $17 billion worth of infrastructure projects that have been brought forward to try and maintain that's jobs and spending stimulus. And $3 billion of it is actually shovel ready and ready to go. And they're doing it in such a way that if one state doesn't spend it, another state will get it. So that's really going to put the impetus on making it happen quickly. So if you're a property investor or a property owner like myself, then I always look at where the infrastructure is going to go and then try and get ahead of that infrastructure to take advantage of areas that are about to open up and will increase in value. So infrastructure is the first big number that they're putting energy into, and rightly so, because it does create lots of flow on activity, and activity breeds activity. And activity and spending means jobs. And it creates new areas for employment and new areas for growth. So this is a good start. Secondly, obviously, they're looking to create additional jobs. Because if we get people out of unemployment and into work and earning an income, they're going to spend money to sustain the economy. So there's some great wage subsidies that have been created, particularly for people under 35, because the government knows that as young income earners, when they've got income, they're more likely to spend it. Now, understandably, there's been a lot of criticism on the government of these programs not assisting workers over the age of 35. But if you're looking at where to get the biggest bang for your buck, then older people tend to save it and put their money away. Government really wants us to make sure that the money we're making, we're continuing to rebuild the economy by spending and putting it back into ongoing job creation. And then the third element that's enabling us to spend more is by giving us all tax cuts that have been backdated to the 1st of July this year. Now, while the quantum of tax cuts will vary depending on how much you're earning, the cuts will put somewhere between $1,000 and $2,500 extra per year per person back in your pocket, rather than donating your hard-earned to the tax office. This means an average dual income family will roughly get an extra $5,000 in their skyrocket to spend on things that are meaningful to you. So on the face of it, the federal government appears to be doing everything possible to stimulate the economy and create an environment where we have the means and the confidence to continue spending to pave our road out of recession sooner rather than later. Now, given my interest in property, it's also worth noting that the government has created another 10,000 places in their first home loan deposit scheme, which effectively means that first home buyers' newly built homes will be able to secure a loan with only a 5% deposit. And they won't have to pay mortgage protection insurance or lender's mortgage insurance as it's called in the industry, because the government is actually guaranteeing the extra 15%, which would be quite a saving to most first home buyers of anywhere up to $10,000 or more. Now, this is another good initiative to add to all of the other programs that have been created by the government in recent months, including the home builder grant of $25,000, then first home buyer grants in each of the states ranging from $10,000 to $25,000, plus some stamp duty waivers in some areas. This means that in some states, for first home buyers, you can get your hands on an extra $40,000 to $55,000 as an incentive to build your first home. And if you take advantage of the Super Saver scheme, where you can tax effectively create an extra $30,000 in savings deposit, then the combination of all this is already having a very positive impact on housing values and the construction industry, as construction feeds a lot of tradespeople, which in turn generates incomes and promotes flow-through spending, which continues the growth merry-go-round in terms of the spend. So in summary, the federal government's budget, which is not actually a singular event but a budget of spending and rolling measures that have been coming out since COVID hit in February and will continue with additional measures as they're needed over the next 12 months or more, is creating a massive vehicle for growth. And they've put plenty of fuel in it. And now the engine is idling and waiting for us individually to take off the handbrake and put the spending accelerator down. From where I see it, we're standing on the precipice of a cliff. What COVID has taught us is that we are globally connected as a tribe, and we're driven more by fear than by fortune. The scared, stampeding herd mentality is now more alive than ever, and the mainstream media, and to some extent some global governments, use this against us for their benefit. How we continue to perceive fear and react to it will be crucial to what happens from here. And as I've said on many occasions before, the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. But we all have an opportunity to change that because our eyes are now open. We're at a major crossroads, and what we think and what we do next, both individually and collectively, will determine if the downturn that we've now put ourselves in will keep spiralling into a depression or transitions back into a growth recovery. And the severity of both options relies totally on us, on you and me. And it all revolves around our level of optimism or pessimism in the future. What we think about is what we bring about. Our thoughts and outlook become self-fulfilling prophecies. Think about it for a moment. How many successful people are optimists? And have you ever met a successful pessimist? So I'm going to challenge you to swim against the tide of media negativity, to choose optimism over pessimism, because it is a choice. And your choice, along with the collective of all of our choices, will determine what happens from here. The Great Depression of the 1930s, along with the pattern of recessions that occur every 8 to 10 years after economic shocks, have resulted from the all-pervading mood of pessimism and the lack of confidence that flowed from the initial trigger event. Everyone shifted from optimism to pessimism overnight. The pendulum of outlook swung from one extreme to the other very quickly. Why is this so important? Because our individual and collective level of optimism or pessimism determines what actions we take or don't take. What we're seeing now is a repetition of the economic cycles we see on a smaller scale every 8 to 10 years. So the 80s stock market crash, the 90s recession we had to have, the 2000 dot-com crash, the GFC, and now COVID-19, along with a major reset that occurs about every 75 years or so. And they all follow the cycle of human nature and the pendulum of our swaying level of confidence. If we're pessimistic and we hide our money under the bed and we stop spending, we're headed for a long, deep depression. But if we're optimistic and we keep spending normally, incomes will be maintained and improved, and asset values will increase. So how do we turn around the downturn and avoid a long, slow, painful recession? We spend to mend, save to pave, and invest the rest. We keep spending to mend the economy, and we save some money to pave your way to invest in assets that will secure your future. And this is exactly what the federal government is helping us to do with the release of their latest budget and all of the other pre- and post-programs they have and will continue to instigate. So I challenge you to choose to be optimistic, to spend to mend, to save to pave, and invest the rest. Optimism leads to prosperity. Pessimism will take us to poverty. Which will you choose? To help you make a more informed choice, today's episode aims to give you more food for thought on how you need to think, how you can reduce your risk, and where are the emerging opportunities through my recent interviews where I've hosted Australia's most popular and longest running property podcast, sitting in for Kevin Turner on the Real Estate Talk Show, that you can watch in full on Real Estate Talk. So enjoy these thought-provoking chats with Jaemin Frazer on the importance of your mental wealth. Then I'll discuss the positive impacts on property flowing from the Treasurer's announcement to relaxing lending laws. Sharon Fox Slater, the MD of EBM Rentcover, reveals the importance of reducing risk through specialised landlord insurance, which has suffered a number of post-COVID changes. And to conclude, I enjoy a positive discussion with Ryder of hotspotting.com.au, who opens your ears to the opportunities flowing from the emerging trends in property. So enjoy, and remember that whatever you do, remain optimistic, spend to mend, save to pave, and invest the rest.
Welcome back to this week's show. We've got a really exciting lineup for you this week on Real Estate Talk. I'm Bushy Martin from Know How Property Finance and the host of the Get Invested podcast. And this week we're going to take you on a journey from the micro to the macro. And we're going to start off with an excellent chat with a good friend of mine, Jaemin Frazer, to talk about your mental wealth, because as we continue to work through the challenging and changing times that the COVID is impacting us in the economy, I'm constantly reminded that it's not what happens, but how we respond to situations that counts. And what we see separating the successful from those that don't achieve those results is mindset. It's about beliefs. It's about how we think. And to discuss this, I'm joined by leading life coach and the founder of the Insecurity Project, Jaemin Frazer. Welcome aboard, Jaemin.
Hey, Bushy. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, great to have a chat, mate. Now, just to get straight into the topic, what have you noticed that differs between those that do well during these challenging times and those that don't in relation to their mindset and their beliefs?
Yeah, such a great question. And, when it comes to mindset, it's an interesting space to play in because there's so much lightweight fluff out there that doesn't do anyone any good. But the thing that I've observed that makes a massive difference, and it's the thing that I'm non-negotiable about applying to my own life first, is just the order of operations with which you do your life. So I would say most people and people who struggle would live their life strategy, state, story. So they get up in the morning and what's preoccupying their mind is what I need to do today, what I need to force my way into, what action needs to be taken, what have I got to get done. That's first and foremost. So they do what they've got to do based on whatever state they find themselves in. Sometimes they're in a good state, but under challenging times, often they're under a stressful state. And the state we're in massively controls the outcomes we produce, as is evidenced by the sporting arena every day of the week. It's not necessarily the most talented players or teams that win, but it's always players in the most powerful state. Most people, strategy, state, have no capacity to change their state, and then almost zero awareness of the story they're living out of. So my work with helping people really flourish, I'm always fascinated by beliefs because I think behaviour just flows out of our beliefs, and often there's some really limiting beliefs, some insecurity and fear about whether I'm good enough, whether I deserve. Whether I'm inadequate or I'm going to get found out. So most people are severely limited by those narratives, and they've got no awareness that they are actually the cap on their performance. So I actually think success is relatively easy simply because most people never will succeed. And I think you've only got to get a couple of things right and you quickly rise above the pack. So the opposite operation is to go story, state, strategy. So these are the people who do well in these challenging times. They don't dive into what I need to do, and they don't even manage their state first. They understand their most important work as adult human beings is to be the storyteller in their life, not the actor. So they're very clear about observing the narratives that they find themselves in, stories they may have picked up from their parents or from their friends or from school teachers. Or, it's amazing the beliefs that get formed in our formative years when we're young that never get reviewed, but then become the operating system for our life. So people who succeed are very aware of those narratives, and then they deconstruct them. They realise that they're just stories, and that people who succeed in life tell better stories than those who don't. So they do the work of being the storyteller really effectively, and they do that first. So they make sure they deconstruct insecurity and limiting beliefs, and they write narratives that are empowering and really set them up to have access to success. Then they go prime their state. They practice rituals that give them life, and then they go to strategy. So strategy being last. And if you're aligned to a beautiful story and in a powerful state, then you have access to magic and you do good work. So I would say that is the big difference about the people who are really going ahead right now as opposed to those who are struggling.
It sounds simple to describe, but I'm sure it's much more difficult to actually achieve. How do you help them in changing the story to elevate their state to then get the results?
Yeah, well, I think the hard thing about changing your story is we're very subjective creatures as human beings, so we're kind of stuck in our story and it doesn't look like a story. It looks like a concrete reality. So I think my first point of call in helping people change it is just some simple education around what it means to be a human being and the fact that we are storytellers. Like 5 people all having the same experience and not having the same experience at all. They're all having their own experience because they're all deciding that it means something different, and they're all forming different opinions. So just that in itself just is a game changer for people, just to see how much fiction is happening at all times in our life. And the moment you see it's all fiction and you're the one who wrote it, you kind of realise that you could then also change it and update it. So that's how I lead people into the process of changing their stories.
Yeah, I love it, mate, and it's very relevant to our times, given the negative read that a lot of people are putting on, particularly given the barrage of negative media that tends to permeate and drown us in that exercise. But tell me, Jaemin, what impact does operating in that sort of fear scarcity state have on the listener's ability to get ahead there?
2 things. I think whatever we believe, we will find evidence for. So if you operate with a fear that things will be bad and get worse, that is exactly what you will find. In fact, that's all that you can see. Secondly, is it always takes you to a smaller place. Fear calls you to pull back and retract and live life in a much smaller space. So it can only lead to less if that's what you're putting out and that's what you're focusing on. So the people who I see moving ahead, they are sure there are some concerns and challenges. I'm not saying everything's all beer and Skittles, but that's not what they pay attention to. They pay attention to what is good in their life, what they're grateful for, who they love. They make sure that they operate out of a place of loving themselves, which might sound a bit lightweight, but ultimately it's an incredibly strong base. If you don't have a strong self-love, then you're going to be needy and desperate in the world and constantly looking for outside things to validate you. So definitely weakens you to focus on fear rather than the alternative.
Yeah, it's a very timely message for this time, and I guess it's the old story of looking for the opportunity in change rather than the threat that comes out of it. So I really appreciate you spending a couple of minutes with us on that today, Jaemin. Really great food for thought. I know you've just published an excellent book called Unhindered, which I'm enjoying the read on right now, and I know that's going to help those watching and listening with their own mental wealth opportunities moving forward. And I know that you're being very generous to the listeners of Real Estate Talk and enabling them to grab a free copy by just jumping on hinderedbook.com and just pay for postage and they can get one in their happy hands. So I really appreciate you with your generosity there, Jaemin. For those of you who are interested in what James got to talk about, you can also do a deep dive to unpack a lot of that in the episode 125 on Get Invested, where Jaemin and I had a really lengthy conversation around it. So thanks again, Jaemin, and we'll look forward to talking to you again at another time. But after the break, we'll be moving into the world of the impact of COVID on landlord insurance with Sharon Fox Slater.
Successful property investors know the value of leverage, but as many as 80% are willing to leave sometimes thousands of dollars of unclaimed benefits on the table every year by overlooking depreciation. Depreciation is the wear and tear of a building and its plant and equipment. The ATO allows the owners of any income-producing property to claim depreciation as a deduction, meaning you will pay less tax. BMT's fee is 100% tax deductible. Call BMT Tax Depreciation on 1300 728 726 now for a free assessment of your likely deductions. That's 1300 728 726 or use the link at Real Estate Talk.
Now, before we get into a great discussion with Sharon Fox Slater, there's been some big news last week by the Treasurer, who's talking about relaxing lending laws if it gets through Parliament in March next year. Now, there's been a little bit of talk about it, but I wanted to highlight the opportunity that potentially is going to emerge from that. Because while it's a subtle change, it's also going to be a significant shift in moving lending from lender beware to borrower beware. Now, that mightn't sound like much, but it's going to have a major potential impact on the access to credit. And it's going to put the onus back on property borrowers to make sure that they can actually service the loans that they're going to take out, which is ultimately the appropriate place for it to be. Now, I think I'm welcoming this potential move because in our finance broking arm of our business know-how, we've seen that in the last 2 years, the pendulum has actually swung too far in relation to the way banks are actually assessing people's applications for home loans and investment loans in particular. And it's got to the point where there's no common sense left in that discussion. And we're in a position now where lending's become way too hard, way too slow, and way too complex. And it's, as I've seen the brokers and I've seen the clients go through a situation where they almost feel like they are blindfolded, hopping on one leg through a minefield, trying to get a loan approval, and we're seeing a lot of the banks, given the pressure they're under from ASIC and APRA and the government generally, to say no rather than looking for a way to say yes. And the old adage that you may have heard of, where Bob Hope talks about the only way you can get a loan is if you can prove you don't need it, is very much the sort of environment that we're currently operating in. And I guess where we need to move is to see a situation where there is some balance coming back into the way loans are actually approved. Because I get very concerned when I see bank credit assessors asking applicants how many coffees they've had in a week, why are their medical expenses a little bit high. I think we've got to a point where we've lost sight of what the responsible lending scenario is all about. And while we all endorse the need to have responsible lending, the onus needs to be on the borrower, who can determine how they're going to make their spend and will alter their spending once they've got a loan in place. So I think this is actually good news. And the reason I say that is going to be good for property sellers, property owners and property buyers is that property has always been a game of finance. And the only time we see property values really significantly influenced is when you can't get your hands on the money. And we're in a situation like that now where money's never been cheaper, but it's never been harder to get. Now, what that means is that, and we saw during the GFC and over the last couple of years in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, where they've tightened the screws on the access to credit, we've seen property values fall. So I think we're in a window of opportunity now in the lead up to the potential changes that will come through in March. And it'll take some time. It'll take some months for the banks to actually make the changes and start to take the handbrake off in terms of those restrictions. But I think as someone looking at opportunity in the marketplace, for those that haven't been able to buy property, that will be a good time to revisit it. For those that haven't been able to borrow enough
to get into property, that will be a good time to start revisiting it. But for those who are in a position to do something now in terms of potentially buying a property, now is a great window, because I'm sure that once that additional capacity and that additional demand comes back in, there's going to be a significant increase potentially in property values, particularly in areas where there's very limited supply and very strong demand. So watch this space. It's going to be a very interesting exercise to see how that rolls out. We'll keep you posted on progress with that, with Real Estate Talk in upcoming episodes. But now it's time to perhaps get a little bit closer to what's happening right here, right now. And in recent weeks, we've actually started to see some states extend the COVID-19 rental eviction moratorium by anywhere between 3 and 6 months, depending on which state we're in. So, and that will obviously have a flow-on effect in terms of rental markets. So to get an update on the COVID-19 impact on landlord insurance in particular, we're joined by the Managing Director of EBM Rentcover, Sharon Fox Slater. Welcome, Sharon.
Hi, Bushy.
Great to see you again. Sharon, tell us how landlord insurance has been hit and affected by COVID-19.
It's been a very unusual situation. What happened was we saw people panic buying landlord's insurance back in March. And so sales were sort of going through the roof for everybody that offered landlord's insurance. And then the insurers were all very quick to remove products from the market. The reason why they did that is because of the risk associated with rent default. There was a genuine concern that a lot of people would be impacted in terms of losing their jobs and not being able to afford rent. So therefore, we would see a massive spike in rent default payments. So it would be fair to say that the insurers panicked because they felt that they were going to be hit with an excessive amount of rent default claims, the likes of which they've never seen before. So that was sort of the first wave, and people have stayed out of the market until recently. We're now seeing a little bit of a very slow comeback with rent default. So it's been very, very interesting. Now, we haven't seen a massive spike in rent default claims. In actual fact, the COVID-related claims that we've received at EBM Rentcover is only about 8% of our overall claims. So there wasn't a massive spike. So that was the first thing. So there really wasn't a reason to pull out of the market, but it was considered a foreseeable risk, and insurers won't cover foreseeable risks just in the same way as they wouldn't. You couldn't go and insure your house knowing that there was a bushfire about to burn it down. So same principle. There are other things that people didn't consider. Everybody's at home, they're working at home, there's been a big surge in people buying pets, and therefore there are other risks that people need to protect during this time, other than rent default, tenant damage. Sadly, there's some domestic violence. So there are all sorts of other things that have occurred during this time. And therefore it's more important than ever to make sure that you've got protection for all of those other things. We did see people not wanting to take out products that didn't have rent default associated with them, but that's because they didn't understand that there are a lot of other risks that are just as important, in some cases more important than that rent default component.
I agree. I think the legal liability alone, we've all seen, given some of our clients and our previous property management business, where you could get perfectly good tenants one day that are, happy chappies, and life changes. You ended up someone turning to meth, and then relationship breakdowns, and before you know it, you've got a restitution bill in the tens of thousands, and or you get someone who trips up on a carpet, who does themselves personal damage, and if the landlord doesn't have legal liability cover, then the insurance company is going to go after them. So 100% agree with you there. I guess, depending on where you're at, I've been very relaxed about COVID personally with our properties, Sharon, because we've got existing EBM rent cover policies with you, and it gives us very good cover and very good protection
around rent default and hardship. So we haven't had any of those COVID-related issues. Just to give us a bit of a summary of, if you're an existing policyholder versus being potentially a new policyholder, what are the differences in what they can expect?
So existing policyholders of ours will not see any decline in cover. They're getting what they pay for. We have seen some insurers reducing cover on renewals. That's not something that we would do. One of the reasons why we supported stopping writing new business was because we wanted to make sure that we could look after our existing clients. It wasn't about getting a whole lot more. And you just find that some people have reduced cover. So whereas they may have covered 20 weeks loss of rent, they might only be covering 10. Ours is staying the same. The difference for new people is that you either can't get cover or you'll get cover that doesn't have rent default. But the other risks, all that the cover is exactly what it's always been.
Yeah, yes. And I think from some of the communiques from you in recent times, there's an imminent potential for rent default to come back in, subject to what's happening around the states. Is that a correct reading of where you're at?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've now been out of the market since, I think it was about Easter time. And so we have enough information to support returning to the market in terms of claim numbers, where sort of the trends are tracking. I mean, interestingly for us, the areas where we're hardest hit in natural disasters, we're still recovering from the devastating fires. There's, constantly flooding, storms, things like that around the country, and we get more of those claims than anything else.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, what are some of the learnings that landlords can take away from what's just happened, do you think, Sharon?
Well, I think the key one is that when you get a rental property, make sure that you insure it straight away and keep the cover. Don't let it lapse, because all of those people that do have cover, like yourself, have nothing to worry about. It's the people that didn't take out cover at the right time that had a problem. And what it highlighted was there are so many people that don't have cover. This surge in, this panic buying I've never seen anything like it. It was incredible.
Yeah, I saw a quote the other day, Sharon, and whether that's fact or otherwise, I'm not sure, but I think it was Compare the Markets, quoted some numbers suggesting that there are about 50% of landlords who self-manage their properties who have no landlord insurance, and something like nearly 50% of claims relate to rent cover. So there's a lot of people are exposed out there, and I guess if nothing else, we've had a massive wake-up call in relation to the importance of having insurance. And we often say to our clients, the cost of a good landlord insurance policy, and I'm talking about ones through specialist providers like yourself, rather than the stuff that you'll get through a bank or through one of the general providers. It's less than a week's rent in most cases, and you've only got to have one claim and see a situation where it takes sometimes up to 10 weeks or more to get to a tribunal hearing. So you've just $3,000 to $5,000 it's just cost you in that exercise. One claim is going to be worth 10 years worth of premium. So definitely reinforce to those watching and listening today that a specialist landlord insurance policy is an absolute must if you're going to protect your risk in holding a long-term asset. And really appreciate you coming on board to give us an update on what's happening, and we'll get you back at a future date to give us further updates. Thanks, Sharon.
No problem. Thank you, Bushy.
Thanks, Sharon. Well, next I'll be chatting to Terry Ryder on emerging trends in the property market, so stay tuned.
With the evolution of social media, marketing of property is no longer linear. Consumers are influenced differently. The Property Show is unique in that it empowers agents to connect with buyers and sellers through personalised content, social media and artificial intelligence. The Property Show delivers personalised, laser-focused marketing by combining new media, social media and audience targeting, and gives the agent a digital voice. See how well the Property Show works, and then let's get started
and telling the world about your property. See it now exclusively at realty.com.au.
Welcome back. Now, as most of you know, there continues to be quite a disparity between fact and fiction in terms of what's actually happening with property values across the country and what's being reported. And discussing the emerging trends and the actual facts, I want to really balance the picture today by having a really good chat with the head of hotspotting, Terry Ryder. Welcome, Terry.
Hi, Bushy. Always good to talk to you about real estate.
Likewise, mate. Now, you've been keeping a pretty close eye on what's happening around the country and where it's heading to. What are you seeing as the strongest trends that are currently influencing property?
I think there's four main trends at the moment, and I think what's significant for me is there's certain locations in Australia that are benefiting from all four. One that stands out is those cities that have got the pandemic under control, the places that got it under control fastest, earliest, and got back to relative normality quite quickly. Their economies are bubbling along quite well. Consumers there are confident, and more so than in places like Melbourne, of course. And their real estate markets are reflecting that. And Perth would be a great example of that right now. The next big trend, probably the most dominant in the country right now, is the one I call the exodus to affordable lifestyle. It's been underway for a few years, but it's been enhanced and exacerbated by the pandemic period, which forced people into lockdown. It's opened the eyes of more people to the possibilities of working from home. And so more and more people are making the choice, well, we don't actually need to be in the big, expensive, congested city. We can move out, get a different lifestyle, more relaxed lifestyle, having sold in the city and bought in, say, a regional centre or hill change town, money left over to do something else. It's a big, big trend, and I think it's got legs, and I think it's going to continue into the future. Another trend is that first-home buyers are very, very active, the most active cohort in the market right now. Interest rates have never been lower. The level of government assistance has never been higher. They're not competing so much with investors at the moment. There was one of the banks announced an interest rate about around 2%, especially for first-home buyers. It's all the ducks are in line for first-home buyers, and they're taking advantage of it in large numbers. And I think it's would be wise for investors to follow that trend and look at where they're buying, because prices will be rising there. Yep. And the fourth and final one that stands out for me is that outside of the big city CBDs, i.e. in most of Australia, vacancies are ultra low, not just low, but ultra low. In many cases, the lowest they've ever been. Yep. 1% vacancy rates and lower are actually the norm around Australia right now, and that's putting upward pressure on rents, and prices tend to follow what happens with rent. So we've actually got four very positive trends driving markets to the extent that right now I think we've got more locations around Australia where prices are rising than where they're falling, which is kind of contrary to the messages we're getting from mainstream media.
Which is no great surprise, and I mean you've seen it over the decades, Terry. The reality is always a bit different to what the press likes to portray. But tell me, mate, of those, what upcoming trend do you think will be the biggest game changer for real estate in the next few years?
Look, I'm always an optimist, as you know, but I think my optimism is grounded in reality, and I think we're actually going to have a real estate boom. It's noticeable that some of the big banks that originally were predicting 20% drops in their prices have admitted that they got it wrong, and now some of them, like Westpac, are actually forecasting substantial increases in prices in the near future. But I think it's going to happen sooner than their predictions. I think we're going to come charging out of this pandemic period, and we're going to have a real estate boom. And it's going to be driven by a number of things, but I think what's going to really inspire a major Australian real estate boom is the infrastructure spend. It's quite clear that the governments around Australia, state and federal governments, intend for Australia to have an infrastructure-led recovery. They're going to be spending big on infrastructure wherever they can. They're going to fast-track projects. They're looking for shovel-ready projects. And we're talking about, in some cases, transport infrastructure projects that are worth multiple millions of dollars. And there's nothing that supercharges real estate markets like infrastructure spending. So I think that's the big factor that's coming, that we're not feeling it yet, but we're going to feel it, and it's really going to turbocharge property markets wherever these projects are happening. So the advice for investors with an eye to the future is educate yourself about the projects that are likely to happen in this trend. Look at the locations that are going to benefit from that trend and buy there. It's always a good policy. Buy property that lies in the path of progress. Follow the infrastructure trail, and more so in the next few years than ever before, I think.
Yeah, I think what's going to support that too, Terry, we talked a little bit earlier on the show about the Treasurer's announcement on relaxing lending laws if it gets through Parliament in March. And as you know, property values are affected by access to credit. So we've got the infrastructure growth, and we've got easier access to credit, and potentially allowing more buyers in and more buyers to borrow more to actually secure property. Then we're actually in the perfect storm, really, supported by very low rates, to see very strong price growth in the areas that are tightly supplied and where there's high demand. Again, it's not one size fits all, as we all know. It's going to be where the people want to be and where there's limited supply of those properties. But that's really good news. So if we did you pretty much answered this question already, but if we were weighing up between the one side that's still talking about potential falls in the short to medium term, particularly from the economists and some areas of the media, versus your thoughts, if you sum that up for us, mate, where are we heading?
Yeah, well, I think we're heading in pretty good territory. Firstly, I would say that this pandemic period that we've just, we've spent 6 or 7 months in it, I think it's been an absolutely wonderful advertisement for real estate, residential real estate as an asset class, because it's shown its true mettle. It has refused to buckle under these incredible forces. It's been predicted that it would collapse, and it hasn't, nothing like it. And as I said earlier, in most locations around Australia, prices are rising, not falling. Despite the reality, the generalised data shows that Australian property values have dropped X% in the last 6 months. Not very much, but that's the average across the capital cities, dragged down by Melbourne and Sydney, but other places have actually gone up. So against that background of this incredibly resilient performance of real estate, I think we're coming into a period where real estate is probably going to boom in many places around Australia. The forces are already building. The federal budget will probably put further impetus under that. The proposed spending on infrastructure at a state and federal level, and also at a local council level, is really going to turbocharge certain locations. And I just think that it's going to be a very, very strong time to be a property investor. And investors have been sitting on the sidelines. Most of what's been happening has been driven by owner-occupiers, first-home buyers and other owner-occupier buyers. And it's time for investors to get off the fence and start getting active, because they're going to miss the boat otherwise.
Yeah, I think those that are in a position to do so now are very well placed to do something if they can actually secure property, because with all of those changes you're talking about, there's going to be very strong upward pressure. Terry, really appreciate you spending your time. For those viewing and listening today, reach out to Hotspotting. What Terry's very good at, and his team are very good at doing, is looking at forward indicators of what's going to happen in property, not what's happened in the rearview mirror. So please check out hotspotting.com and grab a hold of some of the fantastic reports that Terry produces on a regular basis. And thanks for spending some time today with us, Terry.
Always a pleasure, Bushy. Let's do it again soon.
We will. So exciting times ahead all. And that's another wrap today for Real Estate Talk. Another big thanks to Jaemin Frazer from the Insecurity Project, Sharon Fox Slater from EBM Rentcover, and of course Terry Ryder from Hotspotting. I'm Bushy Martin from Know How Property Finance. And if you're up to it, you can hear a little bit more from me on the Get Invested podcast. And if Kevin is brave enough, I'll be back to join you here on Real Estate Talk sometime soon. In the meantime, have a great week, and we'll look forward to being in touch. Bye for now.
Well, freedom fighters, how good was that? To get
get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello@khgroup.com.au. It's HELLO@khgroup.com.au. Or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au/get-invested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening, and as always, dream as if you'll live forever and live as if you'll die